Good day, everyone. I am Samantha Gabriela Honrado from 22BEE. And for today, we will be talking about Krashen's five hypothesis theory. Now, Stephen Krashen's five hypotheses of second language acquisition is one of the most popular theories in SLA. In the previous discussion, we have learned about the school of thoughts in which it includes environmentalism, innatism, and interactionism. So, Krashen's five hypothesis theory falls under the interactionist school of thought, which mainly focuses on interactions between individuals as the basis for the development of the society. Moving forward, the first hypothesis of Stephen Krashen is what we call acquisition learning distinction. Now, here, Krashen pointed out and made the distinction between language learning and language acquisition. To make it more clear, let us try to differentiate the two. So, let us start with language learning. Language learning is how we learn the rules of language. It includes grammar, sentence structure that we usually learn at school. So for Krashen, it is conscious learning. In language learning, error correction supposedly has an effect. Since language learning is only beneficial for monitoring, so we will be discussing the monitoring or the monitor hypothesis theory, but I will give you a glimpse now. So monitor hypothesis states that the learner is consciously learning the grammar rules and functions of a language rather than its meaning. Now, while on the other hand, language acquisition is the application of the language by communication. So acquisition is similar to how young children learn their first language because they do not know the rules, and yet they are able to speak the language by means of communicating. Also, acquisition does not end in puberty, and adults can also acquire. The only difference is adults cannot achieve native like fluency. For Krashen, acquisition is the subconscious process. So, error correction has little effect on language learning. Let's now move to his second hypothesis, which is the natural order hypothesis. So, here Krashen believes that there is a process that proceeds in a natural order in learning or acquiring a language. So, the errors that the language learners commit is related to the stage of language learner or language learning that the student is in. So it is what we call developmental errors. So knowing the differences in ability of the learners, we could say that there are some who tend to acquire certain grammatical structure early and then others later. So additionally, acquirers with statistically significant similarities can be put together regardless of what stage they are in. So, next to Krashen's hypothesis theory is what we call the monitor hypothesis. So, as we mentioned earlier, monitor hypothesis is the consciousness of applying the form or the learned rules that produces better grammatical sentences. So the monitor is used only when these three conditions are present. First is the time. So you take your time to communicate and try to elaborate your message while consciously monitoring the rules and the forms. Second here is when you are focusing on the form, as mentioned above. And third, You consciously know the rules. Of course, you have to know the rules to know that you have committed errors and you want to correct them by saying the message again. So we also have three monitor users, and these are the overuser. They could be the learners who are too exposed to grammar teaching. Best example of these users are the Japanese. So as you can see, or if you observe, they monitor their speech a lot and would always try hard to follow the rules and structure of sentences. Second is underusers. The underusers rely completely on the acquired system. Examples of these users are the Latinos, in which we could notice how fast they speak and are not conscious whether they say the correct words or pronunciation or grammar, as long as they talk and express their message. The third one is the optimal users. Optimal users uses monitor only when necessary to produce correct form without impeding the communication. Now let's move on to the fourth theory in Krashen's five hypothesis theory, which is the input hypothesis. According to Krashen, it is necessary condition to move from stage I to stage I plus 1, that the acquirer understands input that contains I plus 1, where understand means that the acquirer is focused on the meaning and not the form of the message. So this is where learners learn a language through comprehensible input. It is very similar to Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, where students are introduced and guided by a more knowledgeable others, usually the teachers or the educators or the native speakers. This zone is a little beyond the learner's capabilities. So in input a hypothesis, you go for a meaning to acquire the structure. So um, it is also said that in the restatement about input hypothesis, it is related to the acquisition and not learning. It is also said that we acquire by understanding language that contains structure a bit beyond our current level of competence, which is the I plus 1. So input must be I plus 1, but it is okay if it's not only just I plus 1 input. But if the acquirer understands the input I plus 1, then it is automatically provided. So, speaking fluency cannot be directly taught, but rather it emerges over time on its own, and accuracy develops over time too. When learners monitor their speech, they apply the grammar rule and produce correct sentence that serves as comprehensible input. So, some of the evidences of input hypothesis is the first language acquisition of a child. So we talked about motherist from the last discussion, and motherist, or the language spoken by mothers, is not the deliberate attempt to teach language. It is not finely tuned to be used in I plus 1. So it is better to provide an approximate I plus 1 that is roughly tuned and not just finely tuned, because providing a comprehensible input might be missed. So, roughly tuned input will provide I plus 1 more than one child at a time. So, as long as they understand what is said, on the other hand, finely tuned input, even if accurate, will only benefit the child whose I plus 1 is exactly the same at what is emphasized in the input. It would also like to add that we need not to worry if the input is enough or if the child has mastered the structure with roughly tuned input. I plus 1 will reoccur and reoccur. So for the evidences from second language acquisition here, the simple codes, first is the foreigner talk, where native speakers adjust their communication. Second is the teacher talk, when the teacher tries to improve or provide input. And the third is the imperative talk. Now, the last hypothesis of Krashen is called the affective filter. The word affective is synonymous to the word emotional. Now, according to Krashen, when the affective filter is up, the input does not go to the language acquisition device or LAD. LAD needs input to produce what it is called an acquired competence. So, there are three categories of affective variables. First is the motivation. So, when a learner is motivated to learn a language, then their affective filter is down, and the input goes directly to the language acquisition device, which is inside the universal grammar, that is a separate faculty for learning a language. So, the other one is self confidence. So, if you have low self-esteem, then your affective filter is up. So it prevents input to go inside the LAN. Contrary to having a high self-confidence where each input is directed to the LAD and language is easily learned or acquired. And last here we have anxiety. We are anxious and pressured. It blocks the input to come directly to the language acquisition device. So now that we finished discussing the five hypothesis theory of Stephen Krashen, let us now talk about the implication of these theories in teaching. First here is the classroom should be source of comprehensible input if not available outside. So it's very crucial for the teachers or the educator to make sure that the students um, acquire comprehensible input that goes directly to their language acquisition device or LAD. Now, second, of course, a classroom plays a great role here too. A classroom should be conducive and appropriate for learning because if not, an effective filter will be up. And of course, it will block the acquisition of learning into going directly to the LAD or the language acquisition device. So, before we formally end the discussion, I invited two students from BEE to answer the question. Among the five hypothesis theory of Stephen Krashen, which do you think is the most or the evidently used hypothesis inside the classroom?
I'm Helen Grace Lasagna, and for me, one of, or the most evident rather, part or hypothesis that Krashen created is that there is a natural order on how we learn English language. Because from what I recall in our current classes in structure of English, is that there are lessons that students find hard to understand, such as the inflectable attachment of s in verbs, and I think that we cannot learn that immediately unless we learn the gerunds or the ing form of a verb, and that we would only be able to apply the inflectable s if we had learned that previously. So I do think that the natural order is the most evident and most observable part of Krashen's theory. Thank you.
I am teacher Julia, and to answer that question, I think out of the five hypotheses proposed by Stephen Krashen, I subscribe the most to the affective filter because I do agree that negative emotions like stress, anxiety, boredom, or even lack of motivation can cause a learner to uh, decrease his attention span on receiving comprehensible input. That would be all. Thank you.
That is just all for Stephen Krashen's five hypothesis theory. I hope you learned something from my discussion. So special thanks to Dr. Andrew Ray Peña of Philippine Normal University for providing me videos and resources to understand and explain the five theory of Krashen. So that's just all. Once again, I am Samantha Gabriela Honrado, and thank you for watching.